Trọng giới thiệu và kính mời ông Alistair Nolan, chuyên gia phân tích chính sách cấp cao, tổ chức hợp tác và phát triển kinh tế OECD sẽ lên chia sẻ với nội dung những tác động của cuộc cách mạng công nghiệp lần thứ tư và những khuyến nghị chính sách cho Việt Nam. Xin được trân trọng kính mời ông.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's really an honor to be invited to talk here on this subject in this fascinating country. As you know, the OECD is an intergovernmental organization comprising mainly high-income economies, working on the analysis of every dimension of public policy. And I want to talk to you to reflect on a few points that were contained in this major piece of work that was published last year called The Next Production Revolution, and to reflect on some policy issues which I hope will be of relevance and of use to Vietnam. So that's the cover of the book. The book actually focused on 5 families of technology: digital, 3D printing, nano, new materials, and biotechnology. And I had thought in this presentation to talk through the applications of digital technologies in all phases of production, from product design to fabrication and assembly, process control, supply chain integration, product use, and industrial research. But time available for this presentation is actually very short, shorter than I had thought, so I am going to not do that, because I think that many of the achievements and possibilities of these technologies will be discussed in the parallel sessions, and have already been referred to in some of the clips, the video clips which were shown at the start of the session. So what I'm going to try and do is focus on a number of key policy issues which the research in the OECD area have shown to be important, and then to reflect on how these might be of relevance for Vietnam. As Minister An said and pointed to, particularly in the Asian context, many countries are developing Industry 4.0 strategies. In fact, over 30 countries have Industry 4.0 strategies at present, and most of those are developed economies, are high-income economies, with the exception of the major initiatives in China and in Brazil and also in India. I want to point out, before proceeding to policy questions, the fact that many policymakers fear the loss of employment that automation might create. But the evidence actually shows a low level of correlation, very little correlation between automation and overall job losses in manufacturing. So if you look at this graphic, look on the horizontal axis is showing the percentage change in use of robots. That's the penetration of robots in these economies. And the vertical axis is showing the percentage change in employment in manufacturing. If you look at my own country, the United Kingdom, on the far left of the graphic, you see that we've had low rates of penetration of robots, and yet we've lost a lot of manufacturing employment. If you look on the far right of the graphic, South Korea, that currently has the highest intensity of robot use in the world. In South Korea has done a much better job at holding on to employment in manufacturing. And the reason is relatively simple. It's because to be competitive today in manufacturing, you need to use advanced cutting-edge technologies. So it may appear counterintuitive, but by pursuing advanced automation, you're more likely to hold on to jobs in manufacturing than if you don't. Now, this whole subject area of Industry 4.0 actually is a huge governance challenge for many countries, because it requires that governments coordinate best practice policies in a wide array of policy domains, from infrastructure to tax to schools to regulations that govern the operation of venture capital systems and so forth. It's also the case that A variety of new policy challenges are on the horizon. Countries which are digitizing will face policy challenges around which we don't yet have solutions. For example, scholars are currently debating whether the system of intellectual property rights will need to be reformed in a world where machines can invent things. In the pharmaceutical sector, a number of patents have already been created by software. What new standards will be required in a world where blockchain technology, which largely exists at the proof of concept stage, it's not being deployed in a significant way as yet in industry, but what new standards will be required when it is incorporated into industry? And should firms have new data portability rights as they place large amounts of critical data on Internet of Things platforms? These are all emerging policy questions which we don't yet have sure or solid responses to. Now, there's not enough time to address the full kind of panoply, array of policy issues which are relevant. So I was thought, what would I consider to be, from our work, some of the key priorities that a country like Vietnam could focus on? And I came up with these three. The first is to prioritize technology diffusion. The second, to develop the right skills, and the third is to make the digital ecosystem as good as it can be. And so I'm going to talk about the technology diffusion and about skills, and if there's time, I'll talk a bit more about the digital ecosystem. So technology diffusion, then. It may come as a surprise, but the diffusion of many of these technologies is actually very slow. We are easily misled by the spectacular possibilities and achievements of the technology into thinking that they're everywhere and that their impact is major. So look, this is from a major study in Germany that was done by one of Germany's leading think tanks in 2015, ZEW, 4,500 German firms. And we think of Germany as being the cradle of Industry 4.0, yet only 4% of German businesses had implemented digitalized or network production processes or had plans to do so. And you find similar numbers in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere. When you look at a technology like cloud computing, which will become increasingly critical for Industry 4.0, as this graphic shows, unfortunately Vietnam's not included in this chart, but this graphic shows the share of firms in each country which are using cloud computing, and the balloons, the circles at the top of each column, represent the share of large firms using cloud computing, and the rectangles lower down is the share of firms of smaller sizes using cloud. So there's two things to note in this graphic. The first is that there's huge differences across countries in the share of firms using cloud computing. And the second is that in every country, large firms use cloud computing much more than small firms, even though cloud computing is a technology which should level the playing field between small and large firms in terms of access to computation. And so we find diffusion is slow. Let's go give you another couple of metrics around slow diffusion. There was a survey last year of SME manufacturers in the United States, which found that 77% of these manufacturing small firms in the US had no plans to deploy the Internet of Things. A recent study by McKinsey of large AI-aware firms found that only 20% were using AI in one or more core business processes. So we see the slow diffusion. There's big differences between large and small firms in the use of technologies, and there's big differences across countries. And we see that in other technologies too. Take, for example, data-intensive precision farming. It's the large farms which use this technology more than the small farms. Or take the most recent generation of robots. The type of robot you've probably seen the picture of, the Baxter robots, very small, that work side by side with industrial workers. These current generation of robots are not very expensive. They're highly flexible. They require minimal programming. Some of them even imitate the physical operations of their human counterparts. They're suitable to use in small batch production typical of SMEs. And yet it's the large firms which use these robots much more than the small firms. So what can governments do about diffusion, to accelerate diffusion? I'll concentrate on three things. The first is to make sure that firms that have the ambition and the ability to grow using new technologies, that they can, in an efficient way, that they can access the necessary resources, which, particularly human and financial capital, which complement the growth process. And here we see again big differences across countries in the microeconomic framework conditions which enable efficient resource allocation processes. And there are no mysteries here. We know what these framework conditions are. And let me just illustrate how important they are. So this graphic is showing us, on the vertical axis, the percentage change in access to external capital for firms in different countries associated with a 10% increase in the stock of patents in each one of these countries. So that, as you see here, take Italy on the far right, as Italian firms increase their patenting, they receive only a third as much increase in external finance as do firms in the United States. So countries like Vietnam want to be more towards the framework conditions operating on the left-hand side of the graphic than on the right-hand side of the graphic. Two key points is that we know what these framework conditions are. They've been well studied. They have to do with competitive product markets, flexible labor markets, efficient bankruptcy regimes, low costs for starting and closing a business, low costs of contract enforcement, and so forth. And it's important to note that getting these framework conditions right is not expensive from a fiscal standpoint. It doesn't require that the government spend a lot of money on new programs. So the second condition for diffusion has to do with a high rate of company births, a high rate of entrepreneurial activity, but of firms which have the ambition to grow. And I was fascinated to see Minister Ann's observations about the programs in place to foster tech-based and science-based entrepreneurship. Why is this particularly important, the startup rate? Well, a key reason is that to create benefits from technology, it's not enough to own the technology. All the empirical research shows that ownership of the technology has to be complemented with changes in business processes, with changes in organizational and skill structures within firms. And it's very often more difficult for large incumbent firms to make those changes. Often the smaller firms, because they're not linked to legacy systems, can introduce such business organizational innovations more readily. And we see from previous industrial revolutions that the full impact of the technologies has mainly occurred on the back of a wave of new business creation. And the third issue that governments need to be concerned with is the governance, the design and evaluation of specialized institutions which have a specific objective of fostering diffusion. And now, in the book, we have a whole chapter on these institutions, and there are many such institutions around the globe. They do different things, and we've set out a typology, an approximate typology of the different categories of function that these institutions implement. Some of them are world-renowned, like the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, like the Manufacturing Extension Partnership in the United States, and like the Industrial Research Assistance Program in Canada. I'm not going to go into detail. There's too much information here. That's in the book. I would just like to highlight, though, some of the challenges associated with diffusing technology to SMEs, because SMEs face greater risk than large firms in adopting new technology, and they're also in a weaker position to bear those risks in adopting technology relative to the large firms. So what can we say are some general principles that governments need to be concerned with when operating diffusion programs that target SMEs? Well, the first is to provide tools that help the SMEs transform. And I think a good model here is Germany's Industry 4.0 initiative that's documented over 300 use cases of digital industrial technologies, so that if I'm an entrepreneur working, say, in agro-food, I want to understand how the technology has been employed in my sector, I can go to the German Industry 4.0 website and read use cases of how the technology has been implemented. A second is that ideally, entrepreneurs will receive information on the rate of return, the return on their investment in the technologies. Very often, small firms are just overwhelmed by technology vendors, by the amount of information out there. They don't understand what will be the rate of return if I make these investments. But it's not enough just to provide information on technology. Those firms need the skills and the assistance to absorb new technologies, especially because in small firms there tend to be fewer people with ICT skills than in large firms. And one good thing to do is what's been done in Singapore with the tech depot there, is to provide signposts to reliable SME-specific expertise, where firms can go to get good sources of SME-relevant advice. You can also seek to target skills development for small firms, and a nice example here is in the United States, the online MOOC, the Tooling You SME, which is it's a non-profit organization owned by the Society of Manufacturing Engineers. And this provides online industrial manufacturing training and apprenticeships. Programs like that, I think, in a country such as Vietnam would be extremely useful. And Minister An pointed to the importance of test beds. I think test beds are valuable in helping the small firms to de-risk potential investments. And if you can link test beds with foreign direct investors, so you get the investors who are working in global supply chains, helping to manage the test beds. This can perform a very important demonstration function for the small firms who can experiment with the technologies being used by the foreign investors and understand at the same time the essential importance of adopting these technologies. So that's diffusion. I think I'll just say a few words now about skills. How much longer? Yeah. I think a first point about skills, and everybody has mentioned the importance of skills, that's self-evident. But a first point is the importance of generating strong generic skills. That's literacy, numeracy, and problem solving. These are foundational skills which serve as the basis for the subsequent learning of technical skills. So if a population has strong generic skills, they're better placed to pick up technical skills later in life. And we know that people who have good generic skills become lifelong learners. Now, Vietnam in the PISA study, I suppose everybody here is familiar with PISA. It's an OECD program which measures literacy, numeracy, and problem solving in a culturally and curriculum and language neutral way around the globe every 3 years. Vietnam has performed extraordinarily well. In the 2015 round, Vietnamese 15-year-olds actually scored ahead of Swedish and British 15-year-olds in mathematics. That's an amazing achievement. That's really to be applauded. There is a key challenge here, though, that these measures assess skills of students in school, and there are a lot of Vietnamese 15-year-olds who are not in school. So there's a continued challenge to get them into the initial education system. And I want to show you some data. If you're familiar with PISA, you may not be familiar with PIAC. PIAC is a follow-up study equivalent to PISA for the adult population. And so these data that I'm showing you are statistically representative of skills in 815 million adults across the OECD area. And what these show is that digitalization raises the need for training. So if you look at people who have, on the horizontal axis, different levels of educational attainment, when they work in a digitalized environment, their requirements for training always go up. They go up less for people who have tertiary education, but especially at upper secondary levels of attainment, when people just with upper secondary education go into the workplace and required to use digital technologies, there's a significant need for upgrading their skills. But the low-skilled are less likely to participate in training. The share of workers participating in training is a function of initial skills. Now, teachers also use digital technologies as much as high-skilled workers. And teachers, though, are more likely to need training. So this is an important lesson from around the globe, which I think invites the need to examine whether teachers also in Vietnam are in a similar situation. Unfortunately, Vietnam is not included in the PIAC survey. But we know from PISA that in the highest performing countries in the world, like Finland, a key variable which is determining success a key variable is the quality of teachers, the education of teachers, and the autonomy given to teachers. And when you ask teachers, if I am more innovative in teaching, will I be rewarded? It's a very sad circumstance that today, globally, only around a quarter of teachers can say yes, that they will be rewarded, not just in terms of receiving more money, but in any other form of recognition. So I'm just going to show 2 more slides about skills, and then I will finish. The issues of digital infrastructure, I think we can address on another occasion. I want to address the question of what future skills are needed. And a key point here is that we can say some self-evident truths now without risk, that we need, in all countries, more skills, more digital skills, and more skills which complement machines. But that's not very useful. We all know that. A key point I'd like to make is that it's not, for policymakers, it's not just about knowing what the skills needs of the future will be. A priority is to design education and training institutions so that they're sufficiently flexible to respond to emerging skills needs, whatever those needs turn out to be, precisely because we don't know what the skills needs of the future will be. Give you a few examples here. When the laptop computer was introduced into the American labor market in the 1980s, nobody foresaw that just 20 years later there would be 1,500 new job categories in the US. When you look at many famous experts in their fields, they've often got it completely wrong in predicting what the skills needs of the future would be. Carl Benz, the creator of the first commercially successful car, believed that markets for automobiles would be limited because there wouldn't be enough people with the skills to drive cars. And when I hear people say, for example, that we need to teach coding in primary school and reorient our school system towards coding, well, I think that, yes, we do need coders today, that's certainly true, but bear in mind the fact that a lot of coding work will be done by artificial intelligence in 10 or 15 years' time. I bet that in 15 to 20 years' time, we'll think of teaching coding something like teaching ancient Greek. And so what policymakers need to target is an education system that provides a lot of information exchange between the market for skills and the students and their parents and institutions. For example, institutions should be obliged, tertiary education institutions, to follow up on their graduates over time to see what's become of these students, where are they working now, what are their wage rates, who are they employed by, and so on, so that prospective students in these institutions can better gauge themselves where market demand lies. And the system needs to be flexible so that resources can travel to faculties and subject areas and to institutions which best respond to emerging skills needs. So with no more time left, I will leave it there, and thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here.
Thank you very much.